Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on wherever you are. Welcome to the NAPSA Member Administrator Webinar Series for July 2017. We're glad that all of you could join us today. My name is Andrew Capehart, and I'm the Assistant Director for the National Adult Protective Services Association, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. This webinar series is organized by the NAPSA Regional Representatives Advisory Board, who meets and advises NAPSA's Board of Directors on all happenings across the U.S. The webinar series is specifically marketed towards APS administrators, but any NAPSA member can attend, and we encourage any member to attend. We offer these several times throughout the year, so stay tuned for upcoming topics and times for additional webinars. Again, these webinars are open to all NAPSA members. So here's a map of all of our NAPSA regions. If you're interested in getting involved in the Regional Representatives Initiative, just drop us an email at the address that's on your screen, or you can contact us through the NAPSA website, which is www.napsa-now.org, and we'd be happy to send you some more information. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We leave this slide up for a bit in case some folks aren't connected to audio. If you're not already connected to the audio portion, you want to make sure you have your speakers on, that you're using a headset, or you do have the option of calling in at the conference number that'll be displayed on your GoToMeeting control panel, and then standard long distance charges will apply if those apply to you in any way. And then just a little bit about asking questions today. If you'd like to ask questions for our presenter, you don't need to wait until we pause for questions. You can type your questions into the question box as outlined in red on this slide, and I will relay your questions to our speaker. Just a reminder to please keep your questions brief so that I can relay them quickly to our presenter, and he can answer them for us. So today's presentation is titled Conceptual and Empirical Approaches to Assessment of Financial Decision-Making and Financial Exploitation. And it is my honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Peter Lichtenberg. He's director of both the Institute of Gerontology and the Merrill Palmer Stillman Institute, and the founding director of Wayne State University Lifespan Alliance. He's a professor of psychology and physical medicine and rehabilitation. He's also a clinical psychologist and obtained his PhD at Purdue University in 1986 and completed his postdoctoral training in geriatric neuropsychology from University of Virginia. He received his diploma from the rehabilitation psychology in 97, and he's been at Wayne State University since 1991. So I think at this point, I will turn things over to you, Dr. Lichtenberg, and let me make you the presenter here so that you can display your slides for us. And I will do that right now.
Thank you, Andy. I'm delighted to be here. Great. Are we all set then?
Yep, we're all set. You're ready to go.
Okay, great. Well, I am delighted to present to this group, and I just want to point out that some of the work that I'm going to be talking about never could have been done by myself, and we had a lot of cooperation and collaboration, and particularly with APS in Michigan. And you can see some of the individuals have been so helpful for that, and of course all the funders that we've had. But here's what I hope that I can convey during our hour together. What are the range of cognitive changes both in normal aging and in dementia? What are the traditional approaches to financial capacity, financial decision-making, domains of exploitation, and how do they intersect? This idea that financial decision-making is often key to vulnerability to exploitation. And then I want to present some of our empirical work on conceptual and empirical measurement for understanding financial decision-making. One good way to think about normal aging and cognition is crystallized and fluid intelligence. And the reason being is, overall, we all think about declines that occur, especially in the 8th or 9th decade of life, in cognitive functioning, even among normal, healthy, older adults. Not all, but many. However, if we think about it broken up into crystallized and fluid intelligence, we have a little different picture. Crystallized intelligence is really about expertise. Vocabulary is a good example, facts, knowledge, those things don't go away. As a matter of fact, we accumulate those through midlife into later life. And so it's not until very, very late in life that we'll see crystallized intelligence impacted at all negatively. For the most part, it's an area of growth through the lifespan. In contrast, fluid intelligence is where we see changes in normal aging. Working memory and immediate delayed recall a little bit, reaction speed, we all slow down, problem solving and planning, those things do change very modestly at first, and then towards people's later 80s and 90s, a little bit more significantly, even in normal aging. But there are a lot of individual differences, and it's good to remember this. On the bottom line, you can see this graph. It's across 7 years of people initially in their 70s. One group, they're not demented, but they do show cognitive decline, pretty significant cognitive decline. Another group, the middle group, is the kind of the most representative of what we think of in normal aging, and they show very modest decline towards the 8th year. And then we have our maintainers, and this is about 15 to 18% who absolutely do not. We all know people like this in their 90s. They're as sharp as they were in their 70s, and that is true. They actually are. They're maintaining their cognitive functioning throughout. Well, let's give a case example to bring this home to APS. Professor X gave $350,000 to his grandson across 1 year. Although he was an emeritus professor, he was still teaching. When APS interviewed him and interviewed his neighbors and friends, he was fine. And really, it was the police that requested that they return to interview him. And they used our scale with him. And what they found was he was aware that he had gifted his grandson, but he only thought he had gifted him once for $1,500. He wasn't tracking. He had no awareness of his memory deficit, so he really wasn't paying any attention or tracking there. He didn't have dementia at this point in time, but he certainly had decision-making deficits. And we're starting to see that. I'm going to share with you some of our data, which we are just writing up now and getting published. When we looked at a group of community-dwelling older adults, 200 people, none of whom had dementia, but some of whom showed cognitive decline. Those who had cognitive decline and impaired decision-making, that very bottom bullet point, 3/4 of them have been financially exploited within the past 2 years. Compare that to the cognitively declined but intact decision-making. They only had 13% of financial exploitation, which was the same as those who are cognitively intact. We all know that you don't have to be impaired to be financially exploited. However, it seems like this combination of impaired decision-making and cognitive decline can make people extremely vulnerable. And I think that's what our professor was. And now we look at the continuum for Alzheimer's disease. So that solid line is aging. We think about now the preclinical stage of Alzheimer's, mild cognitive impairment, MCI, and dementia. And we know that it takes a while for all this to unfold. And that's really kind of the danger point when cognitive functioning is starting to decline, but it's still invisible. So if we look at the dementia definition, it's a syndrome, meaning it's a constellation of symptoms that show a decline in function due to a decline in cognitive abilities or neuropsychiatric symptoms. But it's not due to an acute confusional state, a delirium, an infection, or medication complication. And that's step one for diagnosing something like Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is a form of the syndrome of dementia. And when we look at that, we see number two, insidious, or as I like to say, invisible onset. And this is really where I'm coming from. We want to move up how early maybe we can detect vulnerability, especially in decision making, along with some early cognitive decline. But Alzheimer's disease, probable Alzheimer's disease, is progressive, and so there will be a clear-cut history of worsening, and it can have a variety of presentations. This is why we're so worried about it. The numbers are staggering, and they're getting more so in the sense that it's starting to actually happen. So we look at the year 2010, we had 5.1 million individuals with Alzheimer's disease. We're now at 2017, and we're close to this 5.7 million. That's a lot of increase of people, and if we look in that 85 and over group, that's where the biggest growth is because of the numbers, not higher prevalence, but just the higher numbers of people turning 85 and over, and age remains the most significant risk factor for probable Alzheimer's disease. Well, let's talk about another story, Leo and George. And these are cases that are just heartbreaking. Leo, one of George's 2 adult sons, becomes his DPOA after George's wife dies and spends $275,000 of George's money and transfers another $350,000 to his own account. Why? Dad wanted me to. This is Dad's idea. And of course, this guy had lined up an attorney and a financial planner to help him kind of pull this off. So we'll look at some of the specifics as we go on here. The issues: George had advanced dementia. As a matter of fact, George's wife also had dementia. And the record showed that they said, well, George's dementia is so advanced, we can't really communicate with him. So despite the fact that his wife is impaired, we're going to have to be communicating with her. George was not even safe. He was incontinent. He was almost totally amnestic. And he could easily be made paranoid. One really undervalued part of dementia are these psychiatric symptoms, and especially paranoia. He lacked capacity. He was easily influenced. So we can see that George was in the moderate stage of Alzheimer's disease, not the mild stage. There's no way that he made those financial decisions. As a matter of fact, it came out that Leo even signed most of those documents himself. This is the kind of exploitation that we're seeing a lot of. If you want to get some more on financial exploitation, capacity, Alzheimer's disease, this article in the American Psychologist will give you a good thorough review. So let's talk now about defining financial capacity. Really, this is about financial abilities, not about legal financial capacity as much. So Dan Marston's work really is looking very broad-based, the clinical model of what does it take to be financially independent, from basic monetary skills to bill payment, checkbook management, cash transactions, knowledge of assets and estate arrangements. So those are not all things that we need to do in order to be capable from a legal perspective, but these are things from a competency financial ability perspective. We look at these items now, and we can see that most of these are financial task oriented. Can we add up the change correctly? Can we understand the checkbook and write a check correctly, a bank statement the same way? But when you look at domain 6, financial judgment, it's really hypothetical vignettes, mail fraud risk, investment decision, which is really a financial literacy question, and detecting telephone fraud risk. So it's objective, but it's very hypothetical, and it may not relate to the actual decisions that are ongoing. It's overly cognitive too, and as we go on, we're going to see that decision making is influenced by a lot of other factors, not just what your cognitive functioning is or level of it. And unfortunately, hypothetical vignettes overemphasize deficits. It'd be great if we could use objective things just to evaluate everybody and make our determinations, but they overemphasize deficits because of, number one, the fact is decisions are made in context. And hypothetical vignettes are impractical for use by many professionals, including APS. So it's critical that instruments are tailored to specific decisions. This is where the field's really moving to, and it should move faster to. In Don's award-winning lecture, he talked about the fact that decision-making capacity is often the cornerstone assessment for many cases of elder abuse. Balancing autonomy, beneficence, paternalism, always a tough balance. When do we promote autonomy in the situation? When do we need to provide protection? Overprotection is harmful. Underprotection is harmful too. So let's take a look now at some research on financial decision-making in the population. So Hugh and Willis studied couples that were involved in an ongoing aging survey, the Health and Retirement Survey. And over this 10-year study, one person had cognitive decline. The first thing that you saw when a person had cognitive decline was that money management problems usually preceded giving up control of the finances, meaning they forgot to pay the bills, or they paid too much, they paid them twice, and then they said, okay, let's turn over the finances. However, very sobering to find the high percentage, a third of people with dementia remain the primary financial decision maker. So it's not always easy to get people to step out of their roles in couples, and this is probably very gendered for this sample, with men retaining that control even in the face of dementia. Well, the group from Rush, Patricia Boyle, Ducon, who's now out west, Lisa Barnes, etc., has done a lot of work in this area of financial decision making. And basically what they're trying to argue and what their data is showing is that it's not a redundant construct to cognition. In other words, sometimes, about 12% of the time, cognition is worse than decision making. About 15% of the time, decision making is worse than cognition. So decision making really needs to be assessed on its own, is sort of their point. So we've talked a lot about cognition and decision making. Let's look at some of the psychological aspects of decision making. We did a couple studies that had nothing to do with decision making per se, but they had to do with fraud. And we were fortunate to have access to the first kind of nationally representative data set that actually asked any questions about whether somebody was a victim of fraud or not. Not a great question to ask, and you know, because there's many types of fraud, so we don't know exactly what people are thinking, but still we got a feel for it. And we got to study them in 2008 and 2012, so we had some longitudinal data as well. What we found in both studies was the strongest predictor of future fraud, twice as much, was psychological vulnerability, and that was the interaction of depression and low social status. Feeling like people were disrespected, feeling invisible, and having high depression made people much more vulnerable to fraud. And you can understand why, because loneliness really does open us up to things that others might present to us. So now let's go ahead and take a look at domains of financial exploitation. This is based on Ken Conrad, Mickey Iris's and colleagues' work. And the 6 domains in order of severity: thefts and scams. So there's the actual exploitation, the end product, somebody stealing or scamming. But the next 3 really show the process or the methods that are used. Abuse of trust. So when we think of abuse of trust, we have to think family, but beyond that, we have to think of professionals as well, whether it's professional caregivers, people in the financial services industry. Unfortunately, we have abuse of trust across the spectrum. Financial entitlement, where adult children feel entitled to use their parents' money, acting as if it's their own. Hey, I'm taking care of mom now. I'm going to inherit this money anyway, so I'm going to use it. And actually believing that that's okay. There's 2 things about that. First of all, it's theft. But number 2, it really puts a chill, on conversation between the generations. I think nowadays, older adults should always be planning. How am I going to protect myself and my financial future, in terms of what if somebody notices that something is out of line with me? I'm not making good decisions anymore. I'm not tracking information the way I used to. What's the plan? And financial entitlement really quashes that conversation between generations. Coercion. So the whole idea of establishing a confidential relationship, poisoning relationships of the older adult with others, and pressuring or flattering or somehow taking away that free will of the older adult and influencing them beyond what is acceptable in order to get their money. Signs of exploitation. Do you regret decisions that you've recently made? Anyone been asking you frequently for money? And then the Dan Marson things, the money management difficulties. So I want to switch gears and spend the rest of the time kind of talking about our work, our research, our scales, and present those to you. So our first publication was in 2015 on our full scale. And we used the same model that Ken Conrad did. As a matter of fact, we used T and Mickey Iris as our experts to guide us through this concept mapping model. We had 2 expert panels, and what they helped us do was develop a conceptual model and expand the questions that we created, and actually to create a multiple choice kind of test. Well, here's the model that we came up with. That those intellectual factors, these really are rooted in kind of the laws around guardianship, entering contracts, conservatorship, so forth, making a will. These choice, rationale, understanding, and appreciation, these are the core intellectual aspects of an informed decision. But how are they influenced? And that's where we came up with this contextual factors. Financial awareness. How confident am I in my own abilities? Am I helping other people? So how stressed or strained am I? Do I know where my money comes from? So forth. Psychological vulnerability, undue influence, or susceptibility, I should say, to undue influence or exploitation. And we're always wondering about consistency with values, because a lot of the research by FINRA and other places shows that it's when we see these changes in financial habits, financial choices, that we often see exploitation. And what we're measuring really is the integrity of this financial decision. In other words, what's the ability to make this important decision or set of decisions? And that's really what we're trying to measure. We had two conceptual approaches, that theoretical models that really underscored everything we did. First of all, person-centered principles. People are more than the sum of their cognitive abilities. Their life matters, what their life experience was. We've talked about the second one, traditional approaches overemphasize deficits, underemphasize strengths. We see this time and time again. In medical decision-making research, people with cognitive impairment can make informed decisions about their own conditions where they can't assimilate new information about a vignette. And it's always important that the subjective experience of the person with dementia is important. That's why we want to analyze the actual decision and get the older adults to describe to us what they were doing. The second model I talked about, now I can give full credit to Applebaum and Grisso. You know, this really came about when guardianship laws changed. So it came out of the psychiatric field, honestly, the mental health movement. It used to be that if you had a diagnosis of something like schizophrenia or Alzheimer's disease, that's all I would need if I wanted to become your guardian. I'd go to court, file, and say, hey, this person has this disease, they can't be competent. And 30, 40 years ago, the states started and completed changing those laws. And they made it a functional test, not a diagnostic test. Well, what's the functional test? Informed decision-making. Well, what makes up informed decision-making? Well, being able to communicate what you want to do, your choice. An understanding of that choice, including some of its nuances. Appreciation of how that might impact your surroundings and your future, and reasoning or rationale. Why are you making this choice? In our research, working with Jean Teresi at Columbia, who many of you probably know, she's done a lot of work for the New York APS studies with Mark Lax, and Jean is just a world-class statistician, methodologist. So we handed our data over to her, and she did some factor analysis, and we came up with a support for our conceptual model. And I want to share some of these items that came out with you about the financial awareness subscale. How worried are you about having enough money to pay for things? How satisfied with your finances? How satisfied are you with the money management arrangement you have? So the question before that asks, is this the way who manages your money? You do, somebody else does, you get help, what have you. Self-efficacy, how confident are you making big financial decisions? How often do you worry about financial decisions you've recently made? How often do your expenses exceed your regular monthly income? And has there been a change in your finances in terms of seeking advice as you've gotten older? So this is our financial awareness subscale, and you can see it's a mix of financial strain, financial efficacy, as well as changes that have occurred in terms of financial approaches. Well, we were shocked by some of these numbers. There's a lot of economic insecurity in our older population. 50%, 58% were somewhat or very worried about having enough money to pay for things. Almost a third were unsure or not confident about making big financial decisions, a lack of efficacy. Over a quarter were worried about certain financial decisions they'd recently made, and nearly half were helping somebody financially on a regular basis. So the 2008 economic crisis really did spur older adults becoming financial helpers to their children and or grandchildren, and that's still going on. Our psychological psychosocial vulnerability subscale, how often do you wish you had someone to talk to about finances? How often do you feel anxious about financial decisions or downhearted about your financial situation? Has memory loss interfered with your everyday financial activities? How often are you treated with less respect? How fearful are you that someone will take away your financial freedom? And how often do you feel relieved when talking about finances because you are lonely? We're trying to figure out ways to get at this aspect of loneliness, loss of status. 41% wish they had someone to talk to about their finances. Well, guess what? I think the scammers really like this statistic because they want to be the ones that the older adult speaks to. Over a third are anxious about their finances. Many have lost a confidant or are downhearted and blue. Over a third said they were treated with less respect around financial transactions than others. And about 15% rated themselves as having poor memory and thinking skills that interfered with financial matters than a year ago. Finally, our susceptibility subscale. Has a relationship with a family member become strained due to finances as you've grown older? How often has a person talked you into a decision to spend money that you didn't originally want to? Did anyone ever tell you that someone else you know wants to take your money? Have you had any conflicts with anyone about the way you spend your money? Has anyone taken your money without your permission? How likely is it that anyone wants to take or use your money without your permission? So we see that susceptibility is about conflict with others, especially others close to you, and about kind of things happening where people are using your money without your permission. Just about 1/3 had a significant relationship change due to finances. Most of that, of course, was with adult children. It didn't include spouses, by the way. We just took that as a given. We were really interested in others. So we just thought, the spousal unit, that may or may not happen. But how about outside of that? And it was almost 1/3. 16% had conflicts with somebody about money. 20% had had money taken, half of which were pretty large amounts. But very few people were worried that someone was plotting to take over their finances. So one of the things about those subscales, we have now the rating scale short form is 33 items, and it's all those subscales plus these next 10 items. So the contextual factors, those 3 subscales are self-report items, and now I'm going to teach you about the rating scale, which can be used as a standalone screening scale or is embedded in our short form of our rating scale. Now I'm going to tell you about our screening scale because this is one that is being implemented in adult protective service units in about 5 states now. Not across any state, but in certain regions of the state. 10 items, it's an interview, it's multiple choice, and it really focuses on those 4 key intellectual factors and the potential for undue influence. It's a rating scale, and so I'm going to show you how you actually use it. You don't just get the older adult's response, but you also are marking down what you think is the most accurate response. So if everybody would open their PDF for, and I'm going to use your PDF to kind of go through the scale, but first I want to tell you a little bit about our research. So give you time to either print off or pull up that PDF, and we'll return to it. So we've been doing quite a bit of research on the scale. And we've been having APS workers and other professionals use this scale. Our first study really asked the question, when a professional such as a financial planner or an attorney or a health professional is asking these types of questions, they're assessing decisional capacity. When an APS worker is asking these types of questions, really they're trying to see if they play into whether the case should be substantiated or not, whether it's really exploitation or whether it was an informed choice. Those are very different things. And the first study that we published, we wanted to see if indeed decisional abilities and was a vulnerability for either one of those or both of them. Our second study was our major reliability and validity study. So the first one was published in 2016 in the Journal of Elder Abuse and Neglect. And what we found was that our total risk score was higher for cases that were substantiated versus cases that were not, as well as cases where a professional had a concern about the older adult's decision-making versus no concerns. So it supported our hypothesis that decisional capacity and decision-making abilities are often at the heart of both capacity determination and exploitation determination. Our next study just got published, and this is an open access journal, so anybody can download this one, and it actually has the scale there, although the version you have is even updated from that one. And it's our reliability and validity study. We had a good sample size and a good distribution of age and education. Number one, the scale is really an efficient way to gather information that you're probably gathering about 75% of it already. So it's able to be used by professionals of all backgrounds. Number two, it had excellent internal consistency, so the items hold together, and its factor structure was very good too. And finally, it had very good clinical validity. So let me tell you the instructions. If you pull it up, you'll see this. The best way to administer this, read the question aloud, but don't expand on the response choices immediately. Let the older adult respond and see if it matches, and then you can sort of help them decide between the choices that are there. But you'll see on the left-hand side boxes that are under the older adult client response. And on the right-hand side of the items is where the professional marks what they think is the most accurate response. And the mismatch between the ratings, what the older adult says and what the professional thinks is the most accurate response, is the key to increased risk. So that really becomes a key variable in vulnerability. What are the questions? What's the financial decision you're making or have made? So it's important, you can see the way this is done, we're not getting older adults just to nod their head and confirm things. We're making them communicate to us. So in this way, it's a performance test. Second question, was this your idea, somebody else suggested, or accompany you? Of course, we always want decisions to be autonomous. Doesn't mean somebody couldn't come up with the idea, but we should know about that, and we should be careful. What's the purpose of your decision? This is a rationale question. Why are you doing this? You're doing this basically, are you benefiting yourself or somebody else? And this brings up a good point about the scale. What's the primary purpose? So you might be benefiting lots of people, but who is it benefiting the most? For each of these questions, it's the primary. not all that apply, but rather the primary. What's the primary financial goal? Are you trying to earn money? Are you trying to reduce debt, share your wealth, gift somebody? And that is an understanding question. Do you really know what you're doing? How will this decision impact you financially now and over time? Another understanding question. Is it likely to improve your financial position, have no impact, or put you in debt, or a negative impact? How much risk to your financial well-being is involved? An appreciation question of what are the risks and benefits, the potential consequences, low risk or none, moderate or high. It's okay to make high-risk decisions as long as you're aware of the actual risk involved. So many times we're confronted with older adults that are making high-risk decisions which they feel have no risk to them at all. That's not an informed decision. How may someone else be negatively affected? If I take all my money and give it to NAPSA, that's fine and good. Am I aware that my children aren't going to get any of that? Does that matter to me? So we're looking for that appreciation. Who benefits most from this financial decision? Not who benefits, but who benefits the most. Goes along with sort of the primary financial goal. And does it change any previous gifts or bequests? And finally, to what extent did you talk with anyone regarding this decision? So you can see these are probably questions, at least half of which you ask at least some of the time, and the other half you may not have dipped your toe into yet. But it's a very efficient way. It takes about really no longer than 5 minutes to administer to get some sense of decisional capacity, at least for this specific decision. So the scale is used when you want to understand the older adult's decision-making process. Scam victims are great people to use this scale with, or victims by family entitlement, giving large gifts for the first time, or changes in giving. A lot of nursing homes that have been using this and calling APS in, been saying, well, the person wants to give a gift to their friend, but their friend seems to be coming by an awful lot, and I'm not sure how accurate they are in tracking it. Of course, they're totally inaccurate. The older adult thinks they've given maybe one gift, maybe two, not 2 gifts a week. And so APS can come in and make some changes. Make it conversational. Ask for clarification after the scale has been administered. This is a screening scale. It's going to raise a lot more questions than it that's good. But go through the scale first before you do all those follow-up questions so that you can kind of get a sense of how much risk there is for this person. How do you use the results? One way, physicians are, many of them are notoriously horrible at capacity evaluations. What they do is they write one sentence: this person does not have capacity. That's not okay anymore. And so a lot of times they'll say this person does have capacity, and APS is pretty frustrated. Well, this is a good document to work with to show physicians, well, here's the decision-making abilities, and look at how inaccurate these responses are. So help educate them as to some of the nuances for capacity assessment. Document for the court in conservatorship or guardianship or other probate matters. These are the legal standards. This is all based on the legal standards. So they'll appreciate these terms of understanding and appreciation. And you can document the vulnerability of the older adult. Now, one of the things that we're wanting to do is either primary or secondary prevention too. And so counseling the older adult is something that we're sort of forming, and we're really finding that a motivational interviewing strategy as applied to financial management and safety and decision making might be a good approach. I don't know how familiar everybody is with motivational interviewing, but here's a really good website. It's a collaborative, goal-oriented style of communication with particular attention to language of change. We're trying to strengthen personal motivation and commitment by eliciting and exploring the person's own reasons for change. If I can move from not thinking that I should change anything to contemplating it, it's much more likely that then I can take that next step and make some changes. So it's very compassionate, air of acceptance. It's not a lecture. Honors the person's worth. You can see how person-centered this is, and it really depends on the interviewer's accurate empathy to understand. Same with my scale. The interviewer skills are critical. Okay. I like this. People already have within themselves much is what is needed. Your task is to evoke it. Their own arguments for change are more persuasive than ours, no matter how great we might think our argument is. So here's how we have developed some questions. What do you know about older adults being targeted for financial exploitation? So how aware are they of this phenomenon generally? What do you do personally to protect yourself from scams, identity theft, or theft from people you know? So what's your plan? What would happen? What would you want to happen if someone noticed you're really confused about your money? What are some reasons why it's important to plan? So this gets the older adult talking and thinking about perhaps making a change. And then let's try to plan for it. Motivational interviewing is very brief. It's about 10 minutes total usually, maybe 15 sometimes. And it really focuses on a little bit of education and then this motivational part for change. Let's talk about what you can and will do to protect yourself. What are you saying you're going to do when you leave this office? Are you willing to make that commitment to protect yourself financially? If not, tell me what are the barriers to making that commitment, and when should we follow up in order to see how you're doing? We've had many case examples. I shared a couple earlier ones with you, but we've had some really good success using our scale with the scams, lottery scams, and showing that I just tested somebody yesterday who had an IQ of a performance IQ in the 99.9 percentile, an overall IQ in the 96 percentile, but he really was not understanding or appreciating the inheritance/romance scam that he was involved in, and his decision making was not there. When we looked at IQ, age and IQ adjusted norms, he also was having cognitive problems. Gifting. We've had some success in preventing some exploitation, especially son or grandson or daughter or granddaughter who want something like a house, but really they don't have a job. They're not going to be able to pay for it. The older adult is really going to get wiped out by this because it's going to be their contract and their mortgage. I talked about gifting to a friend. So those are some of the ways that the scale has been used. It is a way to understand the older adult's perspective. It's part of an assessment. It's not the whole thing, but it is a novel way to assess informed decision making. But it's not a check the box test. It's not a complete interview. It does raise more questions. And it never takes the place of the interviewer's skills. Those are absolutely critical to success. Now we've developed a website and we're further working on it. I want to let people know that our scales are totally free of charge and they're never going to be a charge for them. And you can get them either by writing to me and I can send you the instructions. You have the hard copy of the scale itself, and from the PowerPoint you have some of the instructions too. Or you can come on this website and register with us, get an account, and use it. In there we are trying to both have educational materials as well as the scale itself. And it's not going to look like this anymore, thank goodness. It's just too complicated. And so we were able to get some grant money to make it much more user-friendly. But it does have some good demonstration stuff and information and kind of short clips of volunteers who were interviewed. Now I want to finish and leave time for questions by reminding folks there's a lot of great resources out there on Alzheimer's disease and on financial exploitation. And if you haven't been on the Elder Justice website yet, it's fairly new. I was on their rollout of it. It's really phenomenal. I've been on it several times since then, and it's just tremendous. If you want to work with me, there's all kinds of ways to reach me. If you want to try this in your unit, I'm happy to do a webinar training, what have you, and do periodic case reviews with you, look at the cases, discuss them with your staff, get people really understanding how to implement a scale like this. So you can reach me all kinds of ways. I'm going to turn it back to you now, Andy, for any questions that we might have.
Certainly. Thank you, Dr. Lichtenberg. That was very, very helpful. We do have a few questions. And this first question came kind of early on in your presentation where you were talking about financial literacy. Do you happen to know any of the statistics or any information on basic financial literacy prior to Alzheimer's disease or just in the general population? Has there ever, I guess, been a comparison between financial literacy when you're older and then just general financial literacy for the younger generation?
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a great question. You know, there's a great study that just came out in 2017 that looks at financial abilities among older adults, people in their 70s and 80s versus their 40s and 50s. Things like managing their credit, managing their debt, managing their mortgage, paying their bills, and without cognitive deficits. 95% of older adults, similar to those in their 40s and 50s, are managing their money just fine, and their financial literacy is okay for basic things. Once mild cognitive impairment comes in, and they really didn't have their way to look at cognitive decline in that study, but mild cognitive impairment, 80% were still doing those basics, and then dementia, early dementia, 20%. So it really drops off. But we've done some, you know, a lot of the populations that we're studying, that we see a lot of it with APS, are quite vulnerable in many ways. And in the communities they live, they're quite stressed, and there's sometimes quite a low level of financial literacy. And one of the studies that we did, people that were most stressed financially were those that had really overestimated how much money they were going to have during their retirement.
Interesting. Another question we had, Dr. Lichtenberg, has the scale been tested with those elders living under the poverty level, being exploited by small amounts of money?
Yes, yes. Thank you for that question. One of the really important things that happens, and people look at the response choices and say, well, none of my clients have a financial planner, so this scale doesn't apply to me. Actually, it's a question that matters and applies to everybody, and this scale has been heavily used with people who are under the poverty line. And they are, in some ways, more vulnerable to exploitation.
Yeah, we sometimes see a lot of press about large amounts of money that have been exploited, but we forget that, people with very small amounts of money, just a little bit, taken from them can mean a whole lot. So.
Yes, because having a regular income come in when maybe nobody else has that regularity to it really puts a lot of stress, pressure on older adults.
Another question that came in, what's the feedback from states regarding this test and any previous tests used? Has there been any improvement that you know of?
Oh, that's a great question. We haven't really looked at sort of the improvement stage of things. The feedback has been good. I've had some intensive experience with many of the APS groups that have been using it. And at first people use it wrong. That's why we improved the kind of the instructions with the boxes on both sides and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
That actually came from some APS supervisors. But it's a different mindset, and so not everybody can implement it at this point. It's when they do and they get used to it, it seems to be very helpful.
But it sounds like it's a different way of looking at things than maybe some offices have had in the past. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. You had mentioned that APS programs are using this. I think you mentioned that nursing homes have also used it. Can you give us any examples of other types of organizations or industries that have used it?
Yeah, several elder law attorneys have used this, as well as some financial planners. And that's been very interesting. I think it's been eye-opening to them that their clients, over 10%, really are having some decisional difficulties. So I think it really kind of shocked them. Also, it's been good for them. What they've reported to me is sometimes they're getting a lot of head nods, but people really don't understand what they're signing. And so they're going back and counseling people more. So it's really important to have older people communicate their understanding of things rather than just those head nods.
Yeah. Great. And then
I have not been able to.
Oh, go ahead.
I have not been able to get into banks or any other financial services industry, and that's been a challenge and a frustration for sure.
Yeah, I bet that will continue to be challenging. So.
Yes, it will.
And then I think this will be our last question. But have you? Is there anything you can say about using this with people with communication difficulties, maybe who have some sort of physical impairment where they have trouble communicating? Have you run into that, or anything you can say to that?
Yeah, we haven't run into that yet. I'm sure that we could, and I don't really know what the best way for adapting it would be. So I have to think through that a little bit more.
Yeah, sure.
Because it is a communication tool.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, certainly. Well, I think that is it for today. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Lichtenberg. I think I can say with confidence for everybody who was on the presentation that they've learned quite a bit. And because we have your scale to download, if anyone did not get a chance to download it during this presentation, and you can do it right now by just clicking on it in the handout section, but you're welcome to contact us here at NAFSA to make sure you get a copy of it, or to contact Dr. Lichtenberg about that. Just would like to say thanks to everyone for joining us today, and especially to you, Dr. Lichtenberg, for all the information you gave to us. It's very helpful.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andy.
Sure. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Take care.